me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Nina Baker and her talk on Scottish engineering, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. So I'll just set up my slides, Nina, and you can tell me if you can see what you want to see.
Okay, that's great.
Lovely, thank you.
So some people in the audience may know me, some may not. I am retired. I'm amusing myself in my retirement by doing engineering history, mainly researching the history of women in engineering work, mainly dead women and mainly British women, but not entirely. And as we go through the talk, if anybody has any stories associated with the women I will mention, or if anybody knows of other interesting women engineers of the past that deserve to be better known, I'm always pleased to hear from you. Next, please. So the Devil's Porridge asked me to do a talk, and I knew that Neil McGarver had done the previous talk about the Arrol Johnston factory and Dorothy Pullinger and the Galloway cast, so I couldn't do that. But I wanted to do a talk that was about Scottish engineering, and oops.
It's just me, just admitting a few more people, sorry.
Okay. But was about Scottish engineering companies and some of the women engineers that came from having worked in those companies and what they did next. So starting with the company that is most local to Gretna and to Devil's Porridge, Cochran's and Company of Annan, still in existence, founded in 1878, one of the longest continuously running engineering companies in the country. They were known for boilers, they're still known for boilers. This is a very typical boiler from about 1913 thereabouts, and it's quite a small boiler of a kind that was seen on many ships, for doing, not for driving the ship, but for doing auxiliary work, sometimes known as the donkey boiler. And this domed top was very typical of the kind of boilers of the early 20th century that Cochran's were making. Next, please. So the reason I've included Cochran's, quite apart from the fact that they're local to the south of Scotland, and are very well known. They still make boilers, and nowadays their sort of unique selling point is the energy efficiency and the lack of emissions and all that kind of sustainable engineering. But because this woman, a woman called Caroline Hazlitt, had her first training with Cochran's, she came from a rather upbringing, a strictly religious upbringing in the south of England, and she had a bit of a falling out with her family about the things she wanted to do. She was a suffragette, and we're talking about the very early 20th century, and she was engaged to be married to somebody who didn't agree with her feminist views. She had a falling out, and Roland, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you. She asked a friend of hers to find her some work, and the job that her friend found was as a very junior office girl, as a clerk, with Cochran's London offices. And although she was competent enough at sorting out files and specifications and that kind of thing for the boilers for the sales team, it wasn't really what she wanted. And she was transferred up to their Annan office, and where they were actually doing the making of things, of course. And she learnt to do basic drawing office work, and was preparing drawings for blueprinting and specifications. and was very quickly found to be competent, even though she had no engineering training, and was signing off on these specifications and drawings before they went to be made. She persuaded them to let her do 4 months on the shop floor, learning to use the various machine tools so that she would have a clear understanding of what was being done, how things were made, and how makeable that they might be. So she did this work through the war. And after the war, of course, many of you will know, the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act of 1919 made sure that every woman who was doing work that had ever been done by a man was chucked out in order to make way for the men returning from the front. So this was 1919. She was out of work. She'd really enjoyed doing what she did. And she saw an advertisement which Lady Catherine Parsons had placed in the ladies' press for a woman to be the first secretary of a society that Lady Parsons was planning to set up called the Women's Engineering Society. And Lady Parsons and a group of her aristocratic pals knew quite a lot of women who'd worked in engineering in their husbands' firms, and knew that these women wanted to continue with their engineering. And so the society was set up to support such women. And they were advertising for a woman with engineering experience to set up and run this society from a standing start. And that was what Caroline Hazlitt was employed to do. And she was amazing. She had a reputation throughout her life as being extremely energetic, very forceful, and very well organized. And this delightfully colorized photo of women in the very earliest days of the Women's Engineering Society shows, well, I greatly approve. Everybody's wearing a hat, of course. But these were the women who had done engineering work and wanted to carry on doing it and joined the society. And even then, the society had male members who were supporters of this idea. The logo at the top is the very first logo that was ever designed for the Women's Engineering Society, of internal and external calipers in an octagon. And it's incorporated in the President's Medallion to this day. Our modern logo is in the bottom right-hand corner and incorporates an aspect of not just the hexagons that we associate with the shape of a, let's say, an engineering nut and bolt, but aspects of science as well, because we've always included women who worked in the applied sciences too. Next, please. It very soon became apparent that electricity was the coming thing. And a particular obsession of Caroline Hazlitt's was the drudgery that women did in their households. As a girl, she was unwell and spent a lot of time at home rather than at school, and saw how all the women in the household, whether they were mistress or servant, spent a lot of time doing hard physical labor to keep the place clean, to keep everybody in clean clothes and fed. The sheer physical labor of boiling up water to wash clothes by hand. And so she was very keen that the new electrical appliances that were starting to come on the market in the 1920s and 30s would be something that women could benefit from, so that this drudgery would end. And it was clear also that most women knew nothing about electricity. In fact, most men knew nothing about electricity either. And another member of the Women's Engineering Society made a proposal that there should be an association specially for women, helping them to understand about electricity and electrical appliances, but also advising the electricity industry on what women would need and what appliances would work best for them. And the Electrical Association for Women was started in 1924, and Caroline Hazlitt was its director from the start, and she stayed active in the association until ill health forced her retirement in the 1950s. And this photo in the top right-hand picture is of her showing how you change a plug and change a fuse and for an electric kettle. And the classes that the association ran all over Britain were on just this sort of simple thing: how to change a plug, how to change a fuse, how to change an element in an electric kettle, what's inside your electric cooker, what's inside your electric iron, all that kind of thing, to demystify the whole thing for the women of Britain. And some of the very first local branches were in Scotland, and the very first class put on for a girl guide company was in Glasgow. And these classes and social gatherings where they would have outside speakers on all sorts of topics continued up into the 1960s and 70s. And I have met women of only slightly older than me who can remember attending these. And usually if you attended one of these and undertook these simple training tasks, you were given a printed tea towel with something on it like the cross section through a cooker, or the different types of fuses and how to change a plug. And in 1947, Caroline Hazlitt became the first and only woman member of the British Electrical Authority, which she was involved in for many years. And one of the outcomes of her work with the electricity industry was her insistence that the new British standards for plugs and sockets should be safe and prevent accidents of children shoving their fingers in the sockets. So the 3-pin safety plug, these are the early ones from the British Standard 1363, which are the round pins, also fitted into the 3-pin socket, which is known as the shuttered socket, which is what we still have in Britain, even though we're square pins now. And that is a socket where you cannot get your fingers into the holes until the earth pin is in place and the socket has been made safe. And this was something that she pushed through when British standards for the new type of plug and socket were being designed. And as a result of her great amount of work with the electricity industry, the Central Electricity Generating Board arranged for one of its colliers, one of the what are known on the Thames as flat irons, because they were very low to get onto the London bridges. One of these coal ships delivering coal to the power stations all up and down the Thames. One of them is named the Dame Caroline Hazlitt in her honour, which is that ship in the bottom left-hand picture. So this is a woman who started her engineering life in Annan with Cochran's and had the most profound effect on women engineers' lives, ordinary housewives' lives, and everybody who had an electric plug and socket in their house all over Britain. Next, please. So I'm going to skate quickly through the Arrol Johnston story because Neil McGarver covered all this in some detail, and I believe his talk is now on YouTube, so you can catch up later on all of that. But I can't not talk about this very well. So Arrol Johnston's, we think of it mainly as the 2 factories in Dumfries and Tongland, because those are the ones that are still with us, albeit empty and derelict. But the story goes back to the turn of the 19th, 20th century, to their first factory in Glasgow, and then their factory in Paisley before they came to Dumfries and Galloway. Next picture, please. Next slide, please.
Just one moment, sorry.
I
was just making a comment that the sound seemed to be cutting in and out a little bit, Nina, but I couldn't figure out why. I think it might be your microphone. Every so often it's coming in and out.
Oh dear, right.
I don't think it's a major issue. I'm certainly able to hear you, but I've asked if other people could just pop a comment in if it's becoming a distraction for them.
Oh dear, I don't know what to do about that because it's part of the camera.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that big a deal, but I just wanted to see if anyone else was, if it was distracting anybody. All right, I'll move on to the
next one, please.
Yeah.
So the picture in the top left-hand corner is of the factory in Paisley, now long gone, where Dorothy Pullinger had her very first training as an engineer, largely in the drawing offices. And if this sounds like a bit of a cheat, it was a common way for young men to get into engineering if they weren't going to university. And she did later on do machine shop training at the Dumfries factory later on. This is one of almost the only decent picture we have of her at that period when she was a young woman. This is of her with her father, Thomas Charles Pullinger, outside their house. And the bottom left-hand picture is of what she did in the war. So from Paisley, when she started her training in 1911, Arrol Johnston's moved to Heath Hall in 1913. And of course, almost immediately, the war started and they had to go over from making cars to war work, where they were making mainly aeroplanes and parts for aeroplane engines. But in 1916, she was recruited to go and be the lady superintendent at Vickers Barrow and Furnace Shell Factory. And this picture of her in the black hat and the suit in the middle of some of her welfare workers at that factory, where she was in charge of the recruitment, training and welfare of several thousand female workers for the whole of the rest of the war. Of course, when they came back, the story is then picked up largely by Neil's talk of the design and marketing of the Galloway car, which was ostensibly designed for women to drive, and was certainly initially largely built by the women who managed to stay on after the war and work in the factory. Next, please. So here you can see the women working in the factory during the war. The bottom picture is of the factory in Tongland, which opened in 1916 and was supposedly going to be a university for women to learn engineering. Sadly, that didn't really work, but it was a valiant try. And the Galloway four-seater was just one of several models of the Galloway car. And when the museums reopen again, possibly at the end of next month, you can see one of these in the Glasgow Riverside Museum, where they have a special display about Dorothy Pullinger and the women of the Tongland factory. And I think that display will be on perhaps for another year or so. Next, please. However, Dorothy Pullinger isn't the only significant woman engineer to have emerged from Arrol Johnston's. And it's easy for these other women to get obscured because Dorothy has become so well known in recent years. We don't have anything even vaguely approaching a complete list of the many hundreds of women who must have passed through the factory as workers. And we have very few photos. Unlike many other factories doing war work, they didn't take systematic photos of groups of workers. And the only photo we have is from the House magazine in the top left-hand corner of a group of male and female workers. And the woman marked with the green arrow in that photo is the same woman marked with the green arrow in the photo on the right. And this is Margaret Dorothea Rowbottom. She was a maths graduate from Girton. Initially, she taught maths at the posh English girls' school in Brighton called Rodine. And then she taught at a similar school in Canada. But when the war broke out, she came back to Britain, and she was recruited into Tonglan's, into the machine. Well, she was recruited really to Arrol Johnston's, and had some training. And then when the Tonglan factory opened, she was the superintendent of that factory from the day it opened, and was in charge of it from 1917 to 1921. So she was working with these women who it was hoped would learn to be professional engineers. She herself was a bit disillusioned by the University for Women Engineers program, because it didn't seem to work. The vast majority of middle-class women didn't like living in the middle of nowhere in a very cold factory. And it ended up largely with local working class women working there. However, she had her training as an engineer there, and then moved on to a small company about which almost nothing is known, but it was a company in Newcastle called Swainson Pumps, owned by a man called Robert Swainson, and it was partly funded by Lady Catherine Parsons on condition that he employed women to assemble the pumps, and Margaret Rowbotham was employed to be the works manager at Swainson's Pumps. I can't find any records for it really, and it doesn't look as though that the idea worked for very long, because very soon after we see her doing other things. She went back to Rodine for a period, and then she joined Margaret Partridge, another Women's Engineering Society stalwart. Margaret Partridge, who is the third woman from the left in the right-hand picture, also in a dark coat, but without an arrow on her head. She was an electrical fitter, not fitter. She built power stations and wired up local houses to power stations, largely in Devon, but also in East Anglia. So she was an electrical contractor, and she employed Margaret Rowbotham to work with her, and Margaret became the chairman of the company. And this picture on the right, and if you can't perhaps necessarily read the writing under it, but it says perpetrators of the original offence. And this is a campaigning group of women who were caught breaking the law. So the law, which had been brought in just after the First World War, a thing called the Washington Convention, meant that it stipulated that women couldn't work night shifts. And what happened was the second woman on the left in the pale sort of tweedy coat, that is a woman called Beatrice Shilling. And she was probably one of the best apprentices Margaret Partridge's company ever took on. And she was found to have been working at night, keeping the power station going that she had helped to build. And this was breaking the law, and they were all taken to court. And this group of women, so from left to right, we have Margaret Rowbotham, Beatrice Shilling, who went on to become a very well-known engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Then the next woman in the black coat, that's Margaret Partridge herself. The next two women in paler coats are also apprentices, and the woman on the right with the purple arrow, this is Caroline Hazlitt again. And these women campaigned for decades to get that law changed, and eventually it was changed bit by bit. So initially so that supervisory women could work at night, and eventually it was overturned completely, in fact, after the Second World War. But this is the campaign group that pushed that legal change through to allow women to work in factories and power stations overnight. Next, please. So here we have three other women. I only have photos of two of them, I'm afraid. So starting on the left is a woman called Frida Bull. And Frida was the daughter of a man called Johannes Bull, originally from Scandinavia, whose company, Bull's Metal and Metalloid Company, made alloy castings of things like propellers, bronze and other alloys. They were originally in London, but when Yarrow's shipyard moved from the Thames to the Clyde, Bulls and other companies that had been working with the shipyard moved up to the Clyde as well. And Bull's Metalloid Company was active in the Yoker area of Glasgow up into recent memory. And there are people still alive who worked there. And the road it's in is still known as Bull's Lane. So she worked, when she first worked in engineering, that was at the Tongland, Arrol Johnston's factory. She had her engineering training there. And then after the war, she went to the Royal Technical College, which we now think of as Strathclyde University, and did a degree, a BSc in applied chemistry, so that she could do metallurgical work for her father in her father's metallurgical laboratory at Bull's Metalloids. And she worked on things like analyzing and testing the various alloys that they used. Delightfully, having done a little blog that mentioned her, members of her family turned up both from Glasgow and from America. And we suddenly knew a lot more about her, which is one of the nice things about these histories. Sometimes you think you know nothing about somebody, and all of a sudden the family turn up and suddenly you know a lot. The other two women who both worked at Arrol Johnston's were Dora Turner and Annette Ashbury. Annette is the woman in the top picture. Dora, for a period, was doing basically secretarial work for engineers. Although she was doing ordinary typing and so on, her work, Damon's Bureau, was basically, I suppose you'd say, outsourcing technical secretary work. But Dora Turner and Annette Ashbury set up this company, Atlantic Limited, which was an engineering company which only employed women. And they made various things. This was a particular kind of screwdriver. They also made some other items, small manufactured items, which was supported by various members of the Women's Engineering Society. It didn't last all that long, but there was various efforts in the post-war, in the interwar period, to set up these companies that might employ women engineers, and this was one such example. Next, please. So I can't talk about Scottish engineers and not talk about my own personal favourite, which is Victoria Drummond. So the picture we see here is of Victoria Drummond in her apprentice's working kit, and the place where she did her apprenticeship was Caledon shipyard. From 1916 to 1918, Victoria was apprenticed in a motor garage in Perth. And when that folded, she used family connections. She was from the aristocracy, so she had very good connections. She got a job she got a place as an apprentice in the Caledon shipyards. And she worked her way through that, completed her apprenticeship in 1920, and for the next 2 years was a journeyman in the workshops and then in the drawing office. Next, please. In 1922, she got her first job at sea as Britain's first ever female ship's engineer. She became 10th engineer on a blue funnel ship called the Anchises. She then worked for British India until about 1928, when the Depression hit the shipping industry very hard, and thousands of merchant seafarers of all types were out of work, and certainly nobody was interested in employing a woman. And she was ashore for quite a while, living with her sister in London. Her sister ran a women's hostel in London. Now, the sister is quite interesting. Jean Drummond actually worked as the superintendent at Gretna at the Devil's Porridge. I don't know very much about it, but perhaps you people know more. But it's interesting that this family really did their part during the First World War as much as possible. So Victoria Drummond lived with Jean in London until 1940. And then in the Second World War, she made the jump from working for British companies who really did not want to employ a woman engineer to working for foreign flag companies. And her first ship in 1940 was for a Palestinian company, Palestine Maritime Lloyd, where she was second engineer on their ship, the Har Zion. Her next ship was a Panamanian ship called the Bonita. And she was on board this ship, which was this rust bucket you can see bottom left. It was in some considerable state of decrepitude even then. And in 1940, when she joined, it was soon after attacked in the middle of the Atlantic by the Luftwaffe. So as a Panamanian ship, it was not entitled to convoy protection, which is why it was on its own, unprotected in the middle of the Atlantic. And this picture you can see, this drawing, is from a girl's comic of the year after, when she was a national hero, because she sent all the crew, all the engine room crew out of the engine room, and she managed the engine on her own through this crisis and coaxed it from its normal running speed of 9 knots to 12 knots, which was enough for the captain to be able to dodge the remaining Luftwaffe attacks and get the ship across the Atlantic to America, where she was a huge hero. And as a result of this action on the Bonita, she was awarded not only the MBE, but the Lloyd's Bravery Medal, which is the one in the top right-hand corner. And having started to work for foreign flag ships, she realized that this was the only way she was ever going to get qualified as a chief engineer, because the British Board of Trade flatly refused to consider the possibility that she could be qualified in that way. But Panama's examination system was all done anonymously. And in 1941, she got her chief engineer certificate through the Panamanian system. And she worked as a chief engineer for the rest of her career. And interestingly, just after the Second World War, in 1946, Blue Funnel, her first employers, employed her again, and she was sent back to the Caledon shipyard, where she oversaw the completion of 2 of their ships being built there, the Rexenor and the Stentor. So it's interesting that her career had some circular aspects to it. She continued to work at sea until 1961, and it's a great regret to me that I never got to meet her, maybe in the few years after that, before she died, because she's always been my great role model and hero, even though when I went to sea, I was on deck rather than in the engine room. Next, please. So Scottish shipyards are the very bastion of the male definition of masculinity in Scotland, but they've always had women working in them, and not just in the war years. But here we've got some pictures of women working in the war years. Top picture is a group of women at Greenock shipyard, and the slightly buxom lady at the back it is their forewoman, and she was in charge of all the women doing welding and riveting at Greenock shipyard, because she had done the same work in the First World War and still had that knowledge and expertise, and was recruited to do the same again in the Second World War. And clearly the Ministry of Labour and National Service weren't going to take any nonsense about women not working in the shipyard, because this is their leaflet on the right-hand side to encourage women to consider doing exactly this work. And there's a woman heating up rivets in some shipyard somewhere. And this rather nice picture, bottom left, is a painting by war artist Ethel Gabain of women making pumps for ships in weir pumps. And where I'm speaking to you from now in Cathcart, I can see the roof of Weir Pumps factory just at the bottom of my garden. And this is some of the women who did that work then. Next, please. And here is somebody who is still amazingly with us. This is an amazing elderly lady, Netta Harvey. And in 1941, when she was only 18, she answered a local advert for young women to be selected for training to be ship's electricians in the shipyard. And she and 4 others were trained, and we can see a picture of her with her colleagues at Harland and Wolff shipyard. And she worked for them and also for John Brown's on various ships. The ship on the right is HMS Vanguard, which she helped to do the electrical fitting on. And typically the women were working on fitting power boxes and doing the cabling, the wiring. But naturally, like everybody else in 1946, all the women were sacked. And now, unlike the timber gills and the land army women, the women who worked in factories, shipyards, and munition works didn't get so much as a letter of thank you from a grateful nation. There was no medal, no badge, no nothing, just the sack. And she worked largely in retail for the rest of her life. But I'm delighted to say that 2 years ago, we were able to obtain, very late on, but no better late than never, recognition for her work. And she was made an honorary Doctor of Engineering by Caledonian University. And there she is with her degree. And this is a woman who almost certainly had no paper qualifications from her years at school or anything else. So now she is Dr. Netta Harvey, and she's still with us in her late 90s, living on her own, an amazing lady. But she said, you know, it was a sorry story when she was chucked out, but she's still got her box of tools, her hammer and screwdrivers and what have you, which I think is rather sweet. Next, please. So to come up to date, shipbuilding on the Clyde now is very much a female domain. The chief engineers at both the shipyards are women now, and this is Nadia Savage, who is the program director for the Type 26 ships at BAE Systems at Govan. She previously worked in the railways and was project director on the Manchester Tram programme. And BAE Systems are a demanding employer, certainly, but they have done a lot to make it possible for women to be engineers and to not lose track of their careers if they have to have time off to have children. Their proportion of female apprentices is second to none in engineering and certainly in shipbuilding. That they're doing everything they can to make sure that they don't lose out on women's talents for building the next generation of warships. Next, please. So there's lots going on with the Women's Engineering Society this year, because we will be hosting the COP21 conference in Glasgow later in the year, and everybody's thinking about sustainability. The choice of the top 50 women in engineering in 2020 was selected to be themed on sustainability, and several of these are women in Scotland. And at Glasgow University, I'm singling out them because I found this rather delightful picture, but the other universities have similar groups. The FemEng group at Glasgow University is doing amazing work, not only on supporting women engineering students through their careers, but also in supporting women in engineering in other countries in Africa. So I think Scotland has done quite a fair bit to produce interesting women in engineering of the past, and they're doing their very best to produce interesting engineering women for the future. Thank you.
That's just me clapping. So thank you very much, Nina. That was great. Thank you. That was very interesting. So
I haven't looked at any of those chat things that were popping up.
Oh yes, we're seeing some nice comments here. So
I'm really sorry about the sound. I have no idea what the problem might be. I did a system check earlier today, and there didn't seem to be any issue.
Yeah, I think I didn't find it that distracting myself, Nina. It was just every so often it got a bit quiet. But
clearly, some people have done
experiences. Yeah, unfortunately.
So looking at Pat Adamson, I don't think any of the pictures I've used were off cigarette cards. And although I think cigarette and tea cards did do things like, you know, sort of drawings of women in munition work in the First War, I don't think there was ever a set of women engineers. There may have been a set of famous engineers, but I don't know. As for Netta Harvey on Wikipedia, well, she's still alive, so we would have to have her agreement. But yeah.
Okay, let's see what other questions we've got. Oh, we've got great talk. Thanks, Nina. Thank you. Superb talk. Thank you. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, now is the time to speak up, to type in, or to
put your hand up.
Yeah, put your hand up if there's any way that we can get to you, or you can, I think, unmute yourself if you really have a burning issue that you'd like to ask. I will just say here, while I remember and while people have a think about questions, that we will, when the Devil's Porridge Museum reopens, as soon as possible, whenever that will be, we are going to have an exhibition about Dorothea Pullinger, and Nina is kindly loaning us some objects for that exhibition. So if you'd like to know more about Dorothea Pullinger and her contribution to women's engineering and car manufacturing and war work, then you can come along to the museum and have a good look at that. And also, as Nina mentioned, Neil's talk is on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and put in Devil's Porridge Museum, you can see all our talks on there. So we've got a question from Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. Was that 12% of engineers being female across the UK specific to that company, or shipbuilding specifically, or engineering generally?
That's engineering generally. And it's embarrassing, frankly. It varies a good deal from field to field. So women in engineering, there tend to be higher proportions in defense electronics and in aerospace engineering. That has always been the case, and I think it's because those were kind of new fields of engineering back in the day, and it was always more open to them. But if you look at, I didn't share with you the truly depressing statistics where you compare the UK with other countries, but the UK has the worst statistics in Europe and is almost at the bottom globally. But I was trying not to be too gloomy and to talk about the positive stories that we had today.
So I think Liz has asked the name of the person that you were speaking about at the beginning. I wanted to read more about the first woman you described as Dorothy. Could you please spell her last name? I think it's Dorothy Pullinger.
Yes.
Yeah, P-U-L-L-I-N-G-R. But I'll pop that in the chat for you as well, Liz. And that's the lady that you were mentioning we're going to have an exhibition about at the Devil's Porridge Museum. So if you are able to come and see that, that would be great. And thank you, Jane, for saying that you're good in okay. Let me just get my head around this, because lots of questions coming in. Let me go back. So thank you, Wendy, for your kind words about that. We hope to see you at the museum when you come back, when we reopen. Thank you very much for Jaya. Great talk, thanks. With women setting up companies in Newcastle and Devon, who supported them financially? Was it wealthy women that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, that's right. So at the start, the Women's Engineering Society and indeed the Electrical Association for Women was strongly supported by various wealthy women who were very often, they were married to well-known engineers of the period. So Lady Catherine Parsons was the wife of Sir Charles Parsons, the engineer, the Newcastle engineer. So these women put in quite a lot of their own money into these things, but also it was kind of the style of the period. So other women's organizations, and it was both between the wars and up until about the 1960s, women's organizations of every conceivable sort were really popular and well attended, and they were often started up with the support of aristocratic or well-off women. It was just the way things were, I suppose.
So thank you, Jerry, for your kind comment. Nice to see you here. Jane, thank you. Fantastic talk. Thank you, Nina. Lauren said, as low as that number is, I find it a small step forward. As I entered the engineering industry, it used to be quoted about 6% of all UK engineers.
Yeah, that would be
in about 2004.
Yeah, that would be about right, but it's a bit depressing that it's so slow to change, isn't it? Yeah. I have, if you hang on, I'll just get something down. Don't go away. Right, this, I'll show you the end on. This roll of paper is 100 years of government initiatives to get women into science, well, mainly into engineering. There's about 20-foot length of paper there of government initiatives since the early 20th century to get women into engineering. And the speed of change of the numbers, you know, who was it? Where is it? Lauren said, you know, 6% in 2004. 17 years later, we've got to the dizzy heights of 12%. You know, it is more than that in some parts of engineering. Some bits of engineering, it's more like 25%, which is a bit more respectable, but still, it's slow work. But never say die, you know. There's lots of amazing young women entering engineering now. The Women's Engineering Society has loads and loads of amazing young women who are very active and doing great work.
So James says, thank you for an interesting talk. And Anne has asked, when did Strathclyde and Estonian admit female engineering students?
Well, that's a question where almost every word has a well but condition on it. So if we go back to the Andersonian Institute as it was when Anderson set it up himself as a college which was open to both men and women to come and listen to talks about you know, the latest science and engineering. There are pictures of mixed audiences at his lectures, you know, back in the 18th and 19th century. Strathclyde was originally the Royal Technical College, and it provided sort of both technical courses for non-degree type activities, and women attended these quite early on. So there are records almost from the beginning of women attending, for instance, courses in sanitary engineering because they were going to become housing inspectors. But degrees in engineering with engineering labels on didn't really come in until the 1920s. When women were first admitted to universities at all in the 1890s in Britain, most people were taking a general degree, a BA, a bachelor's degree, which might or might not include science and engineering course, but it was a general degree, and only really divinity, medicine, and law had specific degrees. And then general science degrees were introduced, And again, although they included many engineering courses, you know, like machines and electricity and magnetism and so on, they weren't labeled as engineering. And it really, so it's hard to say what counts as an engineering degree. And also, a lot of people come into engineering from having just done a maths degree. So it's not an easy question to nail down. But certainly some of the earliest women taking engineering degrees at Strathclyde would be in the 50s and 60s.
So Jane's asked a very interesting question. Is there any information on how other women treated these women? Was there a lot of criticism from women in other areas of work?
That's a really interesting question. We do know from Victoria Drummond's recollections that because she worked on ships that often had passengers, that the female passengers were not amused, and you know, didn't think it was appropriate work for a woman and all the rest of it. But I don't know. I mean, certainly before the First World War, it would have been, you know, it was very daring, and not many women would be doing it. But once so many women in the First World War had not only done work in factories and so on, but had actually been required to wear trousers to do it in, then I guess, you know, it was more commonplace. And although it wasn't really work for a woman and you only had to do it because it was wartime, it wasn't quite so weird as it had been. But it still was seen as really men's work. But I don't think you'd get criticism except that you were taking a man's job. And that was why Dorothy Pullinger moved on from Arrol Johnston's just not all that long before it closed down, but before it closed down, to set up her steam laundries, because there was a lot of criticism that she was taking a man's work. But I think that would be the main reason.
So there's another question from Wendy, which is, do you know how women in Vickers World War I wages compared to men's, and how hard was it for women to get into these jobs between the wars?
Typically, war work in both First and Second World Wars, women were paid around, well, it varied, but sort of around 2/3 of what a man was paid, and that was considered absolutely acceptable. There was efforts and indeed strikes in both wars to get equal pay, and although the government promised it, it never happened, largely because the male trade unions couldn't see that they were damaging their own cause by not requiring equal pay for women. And they strongly opposed equal pay for women on the grounds that, you know, no woman could be as good as a man. But then what happened, of course, later on is the employers could see that they could employ women at a cheaper rate than men. And when they could, they did so. But to get responsible engineering jobs for women between the wars was hard. And that's why these companies were set up from time to time, which only employed women, to try and give women the opportunity. And it's possibly also one of the reasons why quite a lot of women who are qualified with degrees and so on, or just a lot of experience, like Margaret Rowbottom, went into government service. They went into things like the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and the sort of various industrial research associations, because these were kind of slightly protected in a way, because it wasn't an industrial setting. It was hard, very hard for women to get engineering work between the war.
So Lawrence put a comment about it's noticeable when we go to conferences at a national level, look around the room and see the proportion of women in the room. I have a colleague who moved to Scotland from Algeria who said that the number of male and female engineers were almost equal in his country.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I couldn't have put a figure on it for Algeria, but most of the statistics for Middle Eastern and Far Eastern countries, it's around about the 40 to 50% level. And there's a really interesting book written by a Turkish academic about Turkish women in engineering in Turkey and Syria, and where it is almost equal. And certainly when I visited Syria before the war, they were absolutely astounded that I was even asking about women engineers, because it was just taken as absolutely normal that any woman who'd done reasonably well in maths and science at university would either be a doctor or an engineer. And this woman, this Turkish academic, she makes the point, and I think there's something in this, that if you look at the countries where numbers are more equal, it seems to be those countries where either they were decolonialized in the 20th century, or countries which had a revolution in the 20th century. And in both cases, those have been nations trying to build a nation from the ground up. We are a modern country. Women do everything. We've got a lot of work to do to build this country from scratch. Everybody's going to have to turn to and work. And so it seemed to be the sort of the thing that a modern country did. And we just got left behind in our 19th century viewpoints somehow or other. But it doesn't surprise me that Algeria had those numbers.
It surprises me, so I've looked, definitely, if I hadn't learned anything else tonight, that's fascinating.
Well, if you, I mean, a graph I sometimes use at the end of my talks is of the United Nations data from a few years ago about proportions of women in engineering, and the UK is 8th from the bottom, and the countries below us are countries like Saudi Arabia and North Korea, which is not company I would wish to be keeping, really.
No, definitely not. So Kathy has a question. Were the early pioneering women engineers expected to leave work on marriage, or did they tend to remain single?
Yes and no to both of those, really. A lot of them did remain single, and we've no idea, you know, whether that was a career choice or a personal choice or whatever. But there was a legal marriage bar which required women to leave work on marriage, particularly in the civil service. However, even before that law was changed, there were women who married and carried on working. And it wasn't as if they kept it secret or anything. It's almost as if their bosses thought, well, she's really useful. We just won't talk about it. It's a kind of don't ask, don't tell situation, because Beatrice Schilling was married before the marriage bar was lifted, and she carried on working. She married twice, and nobody seemed the least bit bothered. And there are other examples of women who carried on working. So it wasn't easy, and certainly up into the 1950s and 60s, when you could stay at work after marriage, once you had your first child, you were expected to retire. But yeah, that took a while to change.
So Lauren's asking, will you be doing any more talks on any female engineers? Would love to hear more about Emily Warren Roebling.
Oh, right. Well, there's a talk coming up. Oh God, I've forgotten when this is now. It's later in the summer. I think it's in June. The Institute of Structural Engineers has asked me and another woman to do a talk about women in structural engineering, and I will be mentioning Roebling in connection with the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm doing talks from time to time. Several of them are on YouTube. I could send Judith a link. I could send you a link to where these are if anybody's.
That would be great.
I'm terrified. I'm terrified of losing the Zoom if I go looking for this YouTube video. But quite a lot of the people that I've given talks to have recorded them, like this one. So
yeah, great.
And
Nina,
so Lauren, if you're involved in any organisation that would like a talk, I don't charge any money. And if it's on Zoom, it's very easy to do. I can give a talk anywhere.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. And Nina will be speaking at our conference that's coming up in May as well, so we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, but not about bridge builders.
No, about ballistics. So let me see, I think I missed one person. So Pat says, I believe factories split up male workers' jobs so they did not have women doing the equivalent work and qualify for the minimum wage level. The National Archives did a talk or blog on women at Vickers in the Great War.
Right.
Thank you for that.
Well, I didn't know about the National Archives blog. I was going to have a look for that. That did happen in some places where some jobs, so for instance, if we think about some of the work that Dorothy Pullinger was supervising in Barrow at Vickers Shell Factory, and indeed the work at Gretna, women would be doing the vast majority of the sort of lower skilled work, but they would have men working alongside them on various roles. There was no such thing as a minimum wage level. It was whatever the employer could think he could get away with. And certainly there were efforts in both world wars by groups of women to get paid on piecework, so that, it was, threepence per thousand or something, and it would be the same for the men as the women. And the men didn't like that, and the unions fought against it, because it became evident that women could often do very fast work, and they weren't keen on being shown up. And there are lots of documented cases of factories where the men deliberately sabotaged women's work by either giving them the wrong gauges or adjusting the lathes so that they would make the thing to the wrong size, and so, because they were really concerned that it seemed that you could train a woman to do a skilled job in 3 weeks that had previously taken 4 years to train a boy to do. So yeah.
It's so fascinating, those accounts where, the perception of there's a war on, everyone's in it together, and then you get these little chinks in the sort of the crack of that sort of.
Well, certainly in Scotland, where the trade unions did not support the war in the first place.
Yeah, there were strikes in the coal mines in England as well, weren't there?
So strikes. So thinking about the other big shell factory, the one at Greenock, Georgetown, when Red Clydeside went on strike, the women from Georgetown held a kind of counter meeting the following day. They at which they said, we will do what it takes. The country is at war. Greenock's women are behind the war. We will do everything it takes, no matter what the cost. And because they didn't approve of the men going on strike.
Yeah. So I think it looks like we're just getting into people saying fabulous. Thank you for that.
Okay, well, blah blah.
Thank you very much. That's lovely, very nice. Thank you very much. So that's excellent. So that was wonderful talk. Thank you very much, everybody. So it obviously inspired a lot of interest as well, and lots of great questions. And if anyone has anything they'd like to follow up on, do feel free to email me at my email that I sent out to you earlier, which is manager@devilsporridge.org.uk, and I'll make sure Nina gets that information passed on if you're unable to connect with her in any other way. And if she sends the information around to me, I'll pass it on to all of you as well. Well, it's certainly been a lovely evening from my perspective. I've learned a great deal, and being in Annan right now, it's nice to know about the connections with female engineers.
Well, sadly, Cochran's have nothing about their own history on their website, which I'm slightly surprised considering how long running they are. I couldn't find anything there.
They published a little booklet about it that someone donated to the museum.
Oh, right.
It's quite interesting, but
yeah.
I don't remember seeing anything about Hazlitt in there, but I will tomorrow when I'm in there.
I mean, she was a junior staff member, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah. I do remember they did the I believe they did the iron cladding for the D-Day harbour, the Mulberry Operation
Mulberry. Okay, right, okay. Interesting.
That I was aware of. So so it's been a really interesting evening, and I have got lots of questions for you myself, Nina, but we can talk privately sometime. So it's been lovely to see everybody here, and thank you very much for your time. It's really wonderful of you. And great to see so many people here, and hope to see you at future talks as well. So thank you very much. When you're willing to leave and able to leave, you're welcome to leave. Thank you very much. I'm going to give Nina a round of applause on behalf of all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.